There are new questions today about how terror groups are trying to recruit women. Police say Tashfeen Malik pledged allegiance to ISIS on a Facebook page before she and her husband killed 14 people at an office holiday party in California. But investigators are still working to find out if and how the terror group was able to radicalize her.
While considered rare in the United States, female terrorists have long played a role abroad and could become more frequent. For more on this, we turn to Mia Bloom, author of Bombshell, Women in Terror, and professor of communications at Georgia State University. Mia, thanks so much for joining us now from Atlanta. I've read quite a few of your articles, and it's fascinating here because while we're still awaiting details on if Tashfeen Malik was the one to radicalize her husband or not, it's somewhat unusual to have a female involved in a terror plot, especially with ISIS, because it seems like in a number of these cases with other terror groups that they will use them as suicide bombers, but not with ISIS.
Well, ISIS hasn't been using women as suicide bombers, and in fact, we found a document on the ISIS chat rooms in Arabic that Charlie Winter and I went through, and Charlie translated, and ISIS is very explicit. Women are not allowed to be suicide bombers. They're also not allowed to be fighting alongside men. So what Tashfeen Malik did was she went and exceeded her bailiwick as far as ISIS is concerned. So this is why I suspect that maybe she wasn't actually directed, but maybe only just inspired.
You know, Mia, in one of your articles, you say the only motivation that is unique to women joining a terrorist cause relates to sexuality and physical abuse. What do you mean by that?
So a lot of women who have been sexually abused, and this is not just in the jihadi context, so I saw it when I was doing my field research in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers. We saw this with the PKK in Turkey, that women in many of these societies, if they're sexually abused and they're raped, they're blamed. And in fact, they'll have to be killed by members of their own family because of the honor code. What the terrorist groups do is they embrace these women and say, well, you're going to be killed anyways. You might as well take a few of the enemy with you. But then what we saw in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq affiliate started raping the women themselves. And that's why we saw so many female suicide bombers in Diyala province in 2007 and 2008.
I think another interesting side point to this is that they're really used to get out the message, though. I mean, they're on social media. They're the ones who really disseminate the message from these terrorists.
And they're really effective because one of the messages that they embed is that if you were a real man, you'd step up and you'd save your sisters in Iraq. Or if you were a real man, you would go and join the caliphate in Raqqa. But we saw that Al-Qaeda used women this way. And in fact, if you think about it, we can go all the way back to World War I, that women who saw men on the streets would hand them a white feather to basically say you're a coward. So the idea that women could guilt men into participating is something that is ages old.
I do have to ask you, though, what is the appeal for especially Western women? You know, we saw there were a couple of teenagers from Great Britain who joined this group because it is such a, you know, once they're in there, it's a totally different message, obviously, than what they've been led to believe. But a lot of it is subservient in that, you know, you're going to please your husband or come and be a wife. What is the appeal?
Well, one of the things that Charlie Winter and I found is what they're saying in English is very different than what they're saying in Arabic. So in English, they may be promising women this very exciting lifestyle. We've seen a lot of photos of this. I call it the chicks with clips. You'll see women in hijabs with an AK-47 splayed across a Toyota truck. That is not actually what women are going to be doing because that gives the image that women in ISIS are fighting, and they're not. They're basically going to be married off to the male jihadis, especially the foreign fighters, and they're literally treated as chattel. And so the piece that we wrote for the Daily Beast yesterday talks about the fact that women are just being used as a commodity. Yeah, so we don't exactly know why Western women are attracted, but we think it's a combination of false propaganda and wishful thinking.
And that's sort of I think what's most heartbreaking to hear about what some of these women are doing, because on one hand, people may think that this is something that they do because they're true believers or because it's something that they aspire to, when in fact a lot of your reporting and a lot of the research that you've done shows that a lot of these women are coerced, they're sexually abused, they're forced to, in some cases, they're raped multiple times by members of these terror organizations, and perhaps for some of these women, this may be the only way out.
I certainly think that, for some of the women who have left the UK, my suspicion is that they're in arranged marriages, they're being abused, they're unhappy, and so leaving their husbands and joining ISIS, and there have been a number of women in Europe that have done this, is actually their only face-saving way out. But I do think that ISIS is a little bit different, that they're really targeting very young girls. So they've got two kinds of female targets. The older female convert who, like Sally Jones, is a little long in the tooth and has a history, and that by joining ISIS, she gets to reinvent herself. But they also go after really young girls in the same way that sexual predators do. They target them online, they groom them, and they get them to Turkey. And they're also, treated almost like, a reward for the male foreign fighters. So we get really the opposite polar spectrum of these kinds of women, the really good girls who are getting straight A's and girls who've been really bad girls that want a new life.
And is this something that we're ever going, how do you neutralize this, Mia? What can be done to stop, at least as far as we know, these young women that are joining ISIS and some of them who are being used or who decide themselves to blow themselves up? How do you neutralize that?
Well, so one of the things that Charlie and I have been trying to do is, by talking about what ISIS is saying in Arabic, to demystify it, to let the women who are reading the propaganda in English know this is what you can really expect. Ariel Marari, who's been studying terrorism for half a century, has said that it is our responsibility as scholars to make terrorism known. I think the best way to take the wind out of their sails is to be explicit about what is actually going to happen, not what you imagine or you fantasize might be the case. And so this is where the discrepancy between the fantasy and reality can be used in counter-messaging.
Mia Bloom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Mia talked about young girls being recruited. In some of the reporting, they found girls as young as the age of 9.
In Nigeria and West Africa, Boko Haram has utilized many young women. Just recently in Lake Chad, it's reported that the women who blew themselves up there were young girls.
Devastating.